terrorism, an assault of blood, fire, and fear.
Terrorism.
Palestine terrorist.
Global terrorism.
More terrorism. Attacks within the U.S. between 2011 and 2015 that had a Muslim perpetrator received 4.5 times as much coverage as those committed by non-Muslims.
Many more terrorists are still out there.
Wars to take them out, walls to keep them out.
I want surveillance of certain mosques, okay?
Despicable acts of terror.
Terrorism. It's a terrible part of our world today, but I want to examine it from a different perspective than you're probably used to. If you truly want to fix a problem, we have to go deeper than most people are usually willing to go. So first, I want to start with media to see what society subconsciously thinks about terrorists. Popular movies and trends reflect our deepest emotions and fears. And over the last 10 years or so, one of the largest trends has been movies about zombies. We have movies like World War Z, Warm Bodies, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, I Am Legend, The Walking Dead, Train to Busan, and even more recently, Kingdom. So, what fear does this zombie craze represent? Many scholars have argued that it represents terrorism. Just think about it. Zombies are mindless monsters whose sole purpose is to kill you and eat your brains without really any motive. You can say that they're hungry, but in most movies they don't eat animals and they don't eat other zombies either. And they don't care how badly they're hurt. They don't care if their arms are blown off as long as you die. They don't speak any recognizable language and you can't reason with them. You can't befriend them or get too close or you'll be infected too. The only way to fix the problem is to build giant walls and to kill every last one of them. Even attempts at coexisting are futile because eventually they'll infiltrate your defenses and kill you. Okay, now back to real life. What does this mean? We need to think a little more critically and not believe everything that we hear in the news. The people that we brand as terrorists are still human beings.
إنه تصير هدنة ونرجع عدورنا وننام.
So why have they become so radicalized? Why are we so willing to believe that these people are just evil by nature and just enjoy murdering civilians? I personally refuse to believe that any large group of people is inherently evil and has no motive. In addition, almost every society has some version of this problem. Why do poor people steal bread or commit robberies? Why are so many people willing to walk 2,000 miles through the jungle in order to try to cross the US border? Why do young men join gangs or the mafia? Now, I want to be clear, I'm not condoning or justifying terrorism in any way. But in order to fix a problem, we have to understand its roots. Even if we kill every person in the entire world that we label as a terrorist, if the underlying causes of terrorism are still there, we will never see the end of the problem. We will just see a new wave of terrorists replace the old ones. So here are 3 ways that the West has contributed to the rise of terrorism in order to better help us understand its source and how to fix it in the future. Number 1, drawing borders and Western sabotage. This is a pretty commonly discussed issue, and so I won't delve too deep into it. But one thing that you definitely want to research if you don't know already is the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. 2 other things to note are that the British promised the Kurds their own country after World War I, which of course was never given to them. And the second one, instead of taking in Jewish refugees like most countries do during refugee crises, they decided to give them someone else's land that already had millions of people living there. In addition, during World War I, the British promised the Arabs, if they revolted against the Ottoman Empire, that they would be given independence in their own countries afterward. But of course this never happened, and most Arabs lived under French or British mandates for the next 50 years. At the beginning, Arabs actually wanted to work with Western powers in order to set up democracies in their own countries. However, after being constantly lied to, taken advantage of, and having their natural resources exploited by the foreign powers, their main focus became getting rid of colonization regardless of the costs. According to the BBC, they had gone from wanting to build liberal constitutional governance systems, as Egypt, Syria, and Iraq had witnessed in the early decades of the 20th century, to assertive nationalism whose main objective was getting rid of the colonialists and the ruling systems that worked with them. So what happened? These Arab countries who originally wanted democracy turned to military dictatorships in order to rid themselves of the colonizers. And a lot of these military dictatorships ruled over these countries for over 50 years, preventing them from making any real progress. The Arab Spring in 2011 was a huge effort by nearly every Arab country to move towards democracy. However, it's generally accepted that every country except for Tunisia is no better off or even worse than it was before the revolution. Number 2, regime changes and rigged elections. In the 1900s, the West, and specifically the US, decided that it was in our best interest to forcibly remove governments that we didn't agree with or that supported the Soviet Union. One study shows that the US interfered in at least 81 foreign elections from 1946 to 2000, and that it performed 64 covert and 6 overt regime changes during the Cold War. One of the countries or governments that the West tends to label as inherently evil today is Iran, but it wasn't always always this way. Iran in the 1940s and early 1950s was radically different than it is today. Although they were still majority Muslim, almost no women wore the hijab and many people wore bikinis at beaches. Wealthy men and women would attend operas wearing typical Western dress. And a lot of foreigners would travel to Iran for vacation. So what changed?
The 1953 U.S. and UK-backed coup in Iran overthrew Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The crushing of Iran's first democratic government ushered in more than 2 decades of dictatorship under the Shah, who relied heavily on U.S. aid and arms.
Mossadegh and his government were swept from power in favor of General Zahedi. 300 killed and hundreds wounded is a conservative.
Why did we do this? The British, through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, had monopolized Iran's oil fields and was expected to pay a share of the royalties to Iran. However, when the Iranian Prime Minister asked to audit the company to make sure Iran was receiving the promised royalties, the British refused to cooperate, probably because they were committing fraud.
He argued Iran should begin profiting from its vast oil reserves, which had been exclusively controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The company later became known as British Petroleum, BP.
As a result, the Iranian government voted to take control of its own oil fields and kick out foreign powers. So the UK and the US decided to take matters into their own hands in order to keep control of Iran's oil, and instated the Shah that ruled for 26 years until the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which led to the radical American-hating government that exists today.
اینا همه قدرت مداران عالم و مستکبران عالم به خصوص شیطان بزرگ رو آمریکا بدانند ملت ایران به هیچ قدرتی باج ندارد.
The declassified CIA documents about this coup are insane.
The Americans are discussing with the British whether they'll come in and join the coup, and they're discussing share of the oil, which is exactly what happened post-coup. This coup was always about oil. Iraq was about oil. Venezuela is about oil. If Iraq's only export was turnips, we wouldn't be there.
We are talking about an event 70 years ago that has shaped not only the Middle East, but geopolitics in the world today.
The main concern of United States was that if nationalization in Iran of oil was successful, this would set a terrible example to other countries where U.S. oil interests were present. Of course, American politicians don't want to admit that economic issues are at play with their foreign policies. The British, in fact, were quite honest about this. They said they used the bogey of communism to basically persuade people that the coup was justifiable.
Very similar things happened in Syria and in Egypt, and Americans all learn about the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. The US and UK also overthrew Indonesia's first president and founding father, Sukarno, in order to instate Suharto, who was generally accepted as a dictator and Indonesia's worst president that ruled for 32 years. During this overthrow, supported by the CIA and the MI6, there were mass executions and massacres of suspected communist sympathizers that resulted in the deaths of up to 1 million Indonesians.
The mass killings began after the murders of 6 Indonesian army generals in what was described as a failed coup. General Suharto seized power and blamed communists for the murders. The military, supported by Muslim groups, went on a killer spree.
The coup was just beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, leftists and members of the Communist Party were targeted.
At least 1 million, perhaps 2 or 3 million people were arrested. The Indonesian military intentionally killed approximately 1 million innocent civilians with the active, enthusiastic participation of the United States government.
What happened in Indonesia would soon be replicated in other countries.
And in at least 20 countries, U.S. allies employ the intentional mass murder of civilians in the construction of a U.S.-backed authoritarian capitalist regime.
And more recently, the US has overthrown the governments of Iraq and Afghanistan in the war on terror, which has resulted in the deaths of nearly 5 million people, the vast majority of which are Iraqis and Afghanis. All of these coups in the Middle East, instigated by the West, have led to a lack of stability, the killing of millions and millions of civilians, and a sharp decrease of democracy in the region in the name of US interests and access to oil. Number 3, weapons and proxy wars. The US is the world's largest weapons exporter, and the US's largest weapons importer is Saudi Arabia. So why would the US be best friends with what some call a hyper-conservative radical dictatorship? Ideologically, it doesn't make any sense. So why do we do it? They have oil. So you might be asking, what does Saudi Arabia do with all of these weapons? They haven't been directly involved in very many wars in recent history. So instead, they fund at least 10 different proxy wars against Iran, who is backed by Russia. Did you think that the Cold War between the US and Russia was really over? No. Now we just do it by proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This has happened in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Sudan, where the US and Saudi Arabia fund and back one side of the war, and Russia and Iran fund the other. Do you see anything in common between all of these countries? They are all war-stricken, they are all extremely poor, and they have all produced terrorists that hate the United States. Also, Israel, one of the richest countries in the world, has been the #1 recipient of US aid since World War II. In the words of our current US president, Israel is
the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region.
There was no terrorist organization in Palestine until 1987, after there were young people that were born and raised completely under illegal Israeli occupation and apartheid. In conclusion, the West has kept the Arab world poor for decades through all of these different ways of interfering in their politics and economies for the sake of our own political and economic gain. We have created a world in which in many countries there are no other options for young men except to become extremists. Like any situation, it is far too simple to just write them off as evil people without trying to understand why they do the things that they do. Unfortunately, this issue is extremely complicated, and for most countries there is no simple solution. But the first step to fixing any problem is to learn as much as you can to understand where these people are coming from. Anytime anybody does something that doesn't make sense or that you don't agree with, you need to ask yourself why. What are their motives? If you want to learn more about how terrorists think, I would highly recommend checking out these podcasts and movies. Among the Believers is about a terrorist group called the Red Mosque in Pakistan. 5 Broken Cameras is about nonviolent resistance to Israeli apartheid. Of Fathers and Sons is about radical jihadism in Syria. Coup 53 is about how the US and UK orchestrated the coup of the Iranian government in 1953. And finally, the podcast The Other Latif is about the war on terror, and specifically those that were detained in Guantanamo Bay. Instead of being racist or writing other people off as inherently evil, let's think a little more critically. I always say that the majority of conflict in the world is caused by ignorance and misunderstanding. From people not being able to understand each other, not understanding each other's way of life, and not understanding other people's worries and concerns. Connection is key. As we seek to understand people, to understand where they're coming from, and to understand what their needs are, I think we'll be able to solve a lot of the world's problems.